Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Home in Progress by Repcolite Paints, sponsored by Benjamin Moore. And I want to start the show by saying something that may get your dander up a little bit. Gonna rile some people up. Let's see. If you're thinking about painting the exterior of your home this season, just be aware, gray, cool gray, is losing its grip. It's falling from glory a little bit. It's not gone. It's not banned. It's not forbidden. It's not hideous. I'm not saying any of those things. But its run as the dominant exterior color in American home design seems to be slowing down. Fancy way of saying it's kind of going out. And I know that could make some people a little edgy, but just ride with me. The reason that I think this is happening is pretty simple. Gray became the default exterior color. Everywhere you look, you see gray. Drive through any subdivision built or updated in the last 10 years, and that's what you see. Gray houses, gray on gray on gray. And when that happens, when a color gets that popular, it stops feeling intentional. Gray used to signal that a homeowner had made a considered, modern, fancy choice. When we first saw the gray houses start, I'm sure you remember that. At first, it was a little weird, gray, what's going on? And then, oh man, it really resonated with people. It looked so sharp, so modern, and it just caught on. And that's where we're at now. You got a lot of neighborhoods where it just completely blends in. It's the beige of our era. And homeowners who want their home to look like they actually thought about it are now starting to look beyond it. And that's a real flip in the market. And it's worth understanding and thinking about if you're heading into a painting project this year. Now, of course, let's be fair to gray for a second because it wasn't a bad trend. It isn't a bad trend. It was a reaction to something. Before gray took over, like I said, beige was there. We had a lot of tan, a lot of builder beige. Gray came in, and when we saw that, it felt crisp and clean and a little bit cooler. It really played well with that whole modern farmhouse thing with the black window frames, white trim. It looked really sharp. It still does. It still does. It still does. You can put the bricks down. You don't have to throw them through my windows. It still looks great. But a decade, it's a long time, to run with these same colors. And people are starting to notice that the houses all around them, maybe their houses, are feeling a little sterile, a little samey. So now what we're starting to see are some shifting palettes. Homeowners and designers are moving towards colors that feel like they belong to the land around them. We're seeing lots of warm greens and muted sage tones, earthy olives, sandy neutrals, warm taupes, creamy whites, and grayish, which is that gray-beige hybrid. But these are the colors that we're starting to see more and more now. And you can see that shift in the paint industry's color forecasts as well. We're not just seeing it in our store. We're seeing it all over the place. The big story right now isn't cold, flat gray. It's warmth. It's depth. It's earth tones. It's complicated greens and muddy neutrals and warm taupes and creamy whites. And like I said, colors that just feel more connected to the world, to wood and to stone and to brick and the landscaping and the natural light. And what's interesting is that a lot of these colors, they're not just being talked about for exteriors. They're showing up in interiors as well, which makes sense because they're really grounded natural colors. They feel settled. They feel connected to nature. They don't scream for attention, but they don't disappear either. So they're not boring. They're doing a lot of work right now. And like I said, we're seeing it all over the place. So the short version of all of this, if you've been on the fence about whether to stay with the gray, because it's safe, or to go somewhere else, the design world is saying, hey, maybe go somewhere else for a little bit. Warm tones, nature-based greens, earthy neutrals, that's where things seem to be headed. Now, I know, picking a specific color for your home, that's its own whole conversation. I don't have time for that right now. There are just so many things to think about. Your roof color, your brick or your stone if you've got it, how much sun the house gets, what direction it faces, a lot of things to think about. If you do find yourself in that situation and you need answers before I can get to them next week or the next week, stop out at any Repcolite and talk with one of our color consultants. They'll help you in-store based on photos that you bring in, and some of them will come out to your house for a design fee, and they'll actually look things over in person and make some color recommendations for you to consider. So if you want that, just head to any Repcolite store and start that conversation, or you can email me at radio@repcolite.com, and I'll connect you with the right folks. All right. Don't send hate emails about gray siding on houses. I just want to say that one last time. I like it. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying that things are shifting a little bit. And if you're thinking about making a change or thinking about doing some exterior work, it's always good to be aware of where things are going a little bit. But remember, my first rule of color is this. If you like it, it's pretty much all that matters. All right, there are a lot of tools out there that we use all the time without ever thinking about how they came to be. I was asking myself about a tape measure the other day. When did it come about? How did it get here? Well, it turns out it's a really interesting story, and it's actually connected to Victorian hoop skirts. I've got all the info right after this. Home in Progress is brought to you by Repco Light Paints and Benjamin Moore. You know, people often think of paint as just another line item on the project supply list. But here's the thing. Everything you do, every hour of prep, every stroke of the brush, all comes down to the quality of the paint. The paint is the project. Make sure it's the best. And we're back. You're listening to Home in Progress by Repco Light Paints, sponsored by Benjamin Moore. And today I want to talk about, in this segment, one of the most overlooked tools in the shop or in your junk drawer, in your kitchen, or wherever you keep it, the tape measure. You know, it's hard to imagine a project without one. You need a board cut to 8 feet 6 inches. You grab the tape measure, you pull it out, you mark the board, you make the cut, right? That's it. You move on. How often do you think about the tape measure itself? You know, how it came about and all of that. And yet, what's really interesting to me is that in the grand scheme of things, they're relatively new. You know, they're at most a couple hundred years old, you know, going back to the very basic concept of a tape measure. That goes back, you know, maybe probably about a couple hundred years. The tape measure as we think of it today, you know, the practical tape measure that we use, it's at most about 50, 60, 70 years old, something like that. And that sounds old. I get that. But think about it. People have been measuring stuff for quite a while, you know, pretty much forever. I always had to measure it. How big is that rock, Yak? And then Yak has to measure how big that rock is. Or, you know, Yak's wife wants him to move the rock, you know, this, you know, closer to the house or the cave. The measurements, they had to measure things. So how did they do it? Well, they used body parts originally, you know, hands, feet, arms, fingers. That was 12 Yak fingers wide. You know, that's how wide that rock was. So that's how they did it initially. The Egyptians, they were a little brighter than Yak. They used cubit rods. Surveyors used rods, cords, chains, including something called Gunter's chain. And that turned out to be not as exciting as it sounds. I thought maybe Gunter was like some enormous, you know, mastiff dog or something like that, but it's not the case. Gunter's chain was basically just a 66-foot-long chain made of about 100 links, I think it was, and surveyors would use it. You know, it's useful, yeah, but it's not something that you clip to your belt. You know, it was dirty because it was dragged all over the place, you know, through farmland, over dirt and rocks and stuff like that. It's dirty, it's heavy. It's not wonderfully portable. You know, but they had that. Tailors, you know, people working on clothes, they had flexible cloth tapes. But the problem with those is that they could stretch, they could wear, they could absorb moisture, and that would affect the readings. They were great for wrapping around a shoulder or a belly if you needed to measure somebody's belly. But they weren't ideal for repeated standardized job site measurements. So the challenge was this. How do you make a measuring tool that's flexible enough to coil up, you know, so it's portable, easily portable, but accurate enough that you can trust it, and durable enough that you can really use it on a job site, you know, for real work? Well, that question, that challenge leads us to James Chesterman, you know, one of the stars of our little story that we're gonna tell here. Chesterman, he was born in England in the 1790s, and he started out making powder flasks in London. And that may sound unrelated, but nothing on this show, nothing that comes from my mouth is unrelated. Everything is this massive spinning idea that is all interconnected. Anyway, the flask thing may sound unrelated, but it matters because these powder flasks involve small, super precise, spring-loaded mechanisms. Okay, and Chesterman became completely fascinated with that world, with springs, flex, tension, and controlled energy. That's really important, all right? So he does that for a while. Later, he moves to Sheffield, which is one of Britain's great steel centers, and he becomes especially skilled with flat wire and spring steel. And spring steel is really the key to everything that's going to follow. That's how we end up with the tape measure, okay? Spring steel, it's one of those, it's not Springsteen. That's a different thing. People are probably already confused. This has nothing to do with the singer. Spring steel, it's one of those materials that we barely notice, but it does remarkable, remarkable things. You bend it and it wants to come back. You coil it and it stores energy. You release it and it moves. That basic idea shows up in clocks, in doorbells, in umbrellas, in window blinds, and eventually in measuring tapes. Now, Chesterman, he understood, the whole spring steel thing, and he applied that concept everywhere that he could, every little problem that he found, he wondered if there was a spring steel solution for it. And he found a lot of interesting solutions where he could use spring steel. One example was crinoline frames. Do you know what crinoline frames are? Basically, they're the enormous steel-hooped undergarments that helped give Victorian women that famous bell-shaped silhouette, hoop skirt thing. Before spring steel frames, women often relied on layers and layers of heavy petticoats to push their skirts outward. But spring steel came along and that made it possible to create a lightweight cage under the dress. The hoops could bend, when the lady walked, sat, turned, brushed against furniture, whatever, and then they'd spring back into shape. So it was a fashion application for his spring steel, but it was also engineering. Really, really cool stuff. Chesterman used that same steel, spring steel thinking in all kinds of different things. Umbrella ribs, corset supports, door springs, doorbells, and of course, eventually, tape measures. Okay. Now here's where the tape measure story gets a little bit murky. A little bit tricky to follow. There's a popular version of the story all over the place. It's the story that I started running with. It's the reason I'm talking about this is because I thought this story was so great. But it turns out it's not really true. See, there's a popular story out there that says Chesterman invented the tape measure because the crinoline craze died out. He jumped into this whole crinoline thing. Everybody wants hoop skirts for everybody. And we're going to make them using my spring steel. And I'm going to make these little crinoline cages. And oh man, the money, I'm going to be rolling in money. And then the craze dies out. And he's got warehouses and warehouses and warehouses full of all this flat wire, flexible spring steel wire. What's he going to do with it? And he sits around and, he's debating, every decision he's ever made in life. And then he decides, wait, I can make a tape measure out of this. That's kind of the story. And it's a great story. It's neat. It's tidy. It's the kind of story you want to be true, but like I said, it's not quite right. The timing doesn't really quite work out. That steel frame crinoline thing, that became a major fashion item in the 1850s, but we've got records of Chesterman, working on steel measuring tapes way back in 1829. So the better version of the story is this. Chesterman was already deep into spring steel, flat wire, and measuring tools. And then those same skills became incredibly valuable and lucrative in the crinoline boom. And then when fashions changed and that market faded out, that same flat steel technology could be redirected back into tools, especially longer measuring tapes for surveyors and engineers. In fact, one of Chesterman's most important ideas was the steel measuring chain. And that name tells you a lot. He was improving on the old surveyor's chain, Gunter's chain that we talked about earlier. But Chesterman's version used a flat steel tape instead. It was jointed, I think in 20-foot sections. It could be marked with measurements, and then it could be rolled into a circular leather case, pulled out when needed, and then manually wound back in with a small handle. So it was way more portable than Gunter's chain. But it still wasn't the modern tape measure. The next big step for tape measures came in America at the hands of another inventor. And this happened in 1864 when William Bangs Jr. patented a spring return tape measure. Now, this was absolutely huge. You could pull the tape out, take your measurement, and then let a spring wind it back into the case. You could just let it go and whoop, there it went. Pinched fingers and all, that's the downside to this thing. But man, is that a lot of fun. I bet he had a ton of fun inventing that. Anyway, that was William Bangs Jr.'s big contribution. A few years later, Alvin Fellows improved the idea by adding a spring click that could hold the tape in place. So now it locks in instead of immediately retracting. That's really great. So that's where the tape measure is. It holds steady for a while at that point, and then the next big step in its evolution comes in 1922 when a guy named Hiram Farron solved one of the most important problems with steel tape. A flat strip of steel, it can be flexible, it can be coilable, but if you pull it out into the air, it doesn't want to stay there. It doesn't want to stand there. It bends under its own weight. And that means you need two hands, or you need another person, or you need just a boatload of patience to make it work. Well, Farron changed the shape of the blade to fix this. Instead of making it flat, he curved it across its width, concave on one side, convex on the other, and that shallow curve gave the tape stiffness. It let the blade extend, several feet without immediately collapsing. Now, this is the moment when the tape measure starts to feel much more like the tool that you and I know. And oddly enough, I really don't quite get this, but Farron's original design still wasn't the modern retractable tape measure. He had a blade that could extend a few feet without bending, but you still had to manually wind it all back up. And this is where Stanley Company comes in, the tool company. And they enter the story and they take all of these ideas and mush them together and create what we think of as the modern tape measure. They bought Farron's design and they went to work immediately improving the case, the blade, the hook, and the lock. For example, with the case, earlier tape cases were often round, like tiny little canisters. Stanley Company moved towards a flatter, more squared off case, which made inside measurements much easier to take. And here's something cool that you may or may not know. Check out your tape measure. Most of them have a measurement stamped on them, 2 inches, 3 inches, something like that, right on the case. That's the measurement of the case itself. This means that you can set the back of the case against one surface, extend the tape to the other side, read your measurement, from the tape, and then just add the length of the case that's printed right on the tool. And that's going to give you your final measurement. So no bending the tape into the corner, no guessing. Stanley made that adjustment. They also created that little floating hook on the end of the tape. And this is one of the most clever details on the whole tool. Because when you hook the tape over the edge of a board, that hook pulls outward. When you push it against a wall for an inside measurement, it slides inward. And that tiny bit of movement compensates for the thickness of the hook itself. It looks loose. It feels like something might be wrong, but it's supposed to do that. So don't do what I did on one of my first tape measures and don't fix that. It's not a defect. It's not broken. Don't fix it. Don't secure the hook, or you're not going to be measuring accurately afterwards. So Stanley did all of those things, and then in 1956, Stanley Company added a retracting spring to the curved blade tape, bringing together the two key ideas, a blade that could stand out rigidly and a spring that could pull it back into the case easily. Stanley describes that as the point where the tool became the first modern, coilable, and retractable tape measure. So 1956 for that. Then in 1963, they introduced the Power Lock tape measure, and that's the big one. The Power Lock brought together the molded case, the thumb lock, the yellow blade, the sliding hook, and the one-handed convenience that we still expect today. And when that patent, expired, the Power Lock became one of the most copied tape measure designs in the world. So there you go, tape measures. The next time you pull one out and it extends 6 or 8 or even more feet into the air, locks in place, hooks over a board, and then snaps back into the case, take just a second to appreciate it. It's 200 years of problem solving in that little case there. So pretty cool. All right. It happens all the time. People start a home renovation project and they get about halfway into it, about halfway before they realize that they're blowing their budget big time. Extras creep in, expenses exceed expectations, and stress starts to build. Well, if you've got a project on the horizon, I've got 6 budgeting tips that will help you stay on track with your spending. We'll jump into all of that right after this. Home in Progress is brought to you by Repcolite Paints and Benjamin Moore. Think about it. You spend hours prepping, sanding, taping, and then finally painting. Don't throw all that work away with an inferior product. The paint isn't just another supply. The paint is the project. Make sure it's the best. And we're back. You're listening to Home in Progress by Repcolite Paint, sponsored by Benjamin Moore. And I want to talk about budgeting for a project. And I know budgeting isn't really the fun part of the project. Nobody gets excited about spreadsheets. Well, some people get excited about spreadsheets. Most people don't get excited about spreadsheets when they're dreaming about a new kitchen or a finished basement or a deck or even just, a fresh coat of paint. Spreadsheets aren't the exciting part. but the budget is what keeps the project from getting away from you. And it's something that happens a lot. Home projects generally find a way to get away from us. They have more moving parts than we think. There are the obvious costs that we've got: materials, labor, fixtures, finishes, whatever. And then there are all these little costs that sneak in around the edges. Stuff you broke, stuff you had to rebuy over and over again. And then for the regular people who don't do that kind of thing, like I do, you've got things like delivery, disposal, extra prep, a tool that you maybe didn't know you need, a problem that you couldn't see until the work started. Things like that. So today, I want to give you 6 practical budgeting tips. Nothing complicated, nothing fancy, just a better way to think about the money before the project starts, so you're not scrambling once everything is underway. All right? First tip that I've got: budget for what you actually want. This sounds obvious, but people get it backwards all the time. They start with a number. We want to spend $20,000 on the kitchen, and then they try to force the project into that number. But once the project starts, they realize the kitchen that they actually want, it's closer to $27,000. And now when that happens, they're stuck. Either they have to cut corners, or they end up going over budget and they feel like they failed, or they feel a lot of stress from the fact that they're spending, $7,000 more than what they intended. So don't let yourself get into that point. Don't put yourself in that spot. Flip things around. Start by figuring out what you actually want done. And be really honest about the scope of it. Be honest about the materials that you want to see used. Be honest about the finish level you're expecting. And then price that project out as realistically as you can. And once you've got that number, then you can work with it. If it's too high, okay. Now you have to make cuts intentionally before the project starts. That's a good place to be. You don't want to be making those cuts after the project starts. Before things, you can change the countertops, you can adjust the flooring, you can scale back the extras. But at that point, you're doing it calmly and you're doing it on purpose. Way different from making those cuts halfway through a project, under pressure, where every single choice feels like you're making a compromise. So, first tip, budget for what you actually want out of the project. Second tip, add 20% and treat it like it's already spent money. All right, once you've got your project number, add 20% to it. And then mentally just put that money in a box and label it spent. Not because you're trying to spend it, but because you're being honest about the real cost of getting a project finished. Typically, this is kind of sad, won't news, but typically, a $30,000 project isn't really a $30,000 project. It's a $30,000 estimate. And estimates are based on what you can see before the work starts. But once the work begins, that's when you discover things for real. Now you're living in the real world. You may discover, damaged wood or something, something behind your drywall that you pulled out that's going to have to be addressed. You could discover bad wiring that needs to be updated. New tools that you need to buy in order to keep moving forward on it, a delivery charge that you hadn't counted on, or just, some other cost that was always part of getting the job done, but you just didn't realize it. That's what that extra 20% is for, that you're setting aside. And here's the rule. You only touch that money for costs required to finish the original project properly. I'm going to say that one more time because it's a little convoluted, but it's really pretty smart. You only touch that extra money for costs required to finish the original project properly. This is not for upgrades. It's not for add-ons. It's not, while we're at it, let's add this stuff in. It's not a nicer version of something you already picked. Only the hidden or underestimated costs that belong to the project you already decided to do are things that you would cover with this money. So for a $30,000 project, that means you're really planning for a $36,000 project. For a $15,000 project, you're planning for $18,000. And I know that's uncomfortable. It's a little bit scary. It may feel a little undoable, but try to find a way to do it. Because if that original estimate that you got, the $30,000 project estimate, if that holds, great. You finish with the money left over. But if the project costs what projects often do, what they often cost once they get underway, you're ready for it. You're not panicking, you're not cutting corners, and you're not turning a normal project issue into a financial crisis. So that's tip 2. Add 20% and treat it like it's already spent. Tip 3, plan your contractor farther ahead, way farther ahead than you think you need to. This is one of those project details that people underestimate all the time. They decide in May that they want a major project done in July. It's just 2 months away. It's way in July. That's a long ways away to us. Who don't do the work. We think that seems like forever. And we start calling around and checking in with different contractors. And that's when we find out that that's not that far at all. A lot of people are already booked at that point, and they're booked months and months ahead of time. And the bigger the project that you've got, the longer you may have to wait until somebody's schedule actually clears out for you. So if you're thinking about, hiring a painter or building a deck or, putting on a roof or installing siding or windows or anything like that, don't wait to start making calls until you think it's the right time, because you're probably going to underestimate it. As soon as the project's on your radar, make a few information gathering calls. If it's too early to book it, that's fine. At least just talk to them about when you should reach out to schedule. They're happily going to give you a ballpark idea, and that's going to help you make sure that you're reaching out in time. If you reach out too late, your options, they're going to be limited. And that matters because when people, have limited options, they start making decisions from pressure. They take the first person who calls back. They accept a vague estimate. They skip checking references. They ignore little warning signs because they just want to get the project moving, and they're just grateful that they got somebody out. But that's often, not always, but often when expensive mistakes happen. Ideally, you want time to talk to more than one contractor. 3 bids is still a really good standard recommendation when you're getting work done. Not because you're automatically looking for the cheapest price or even necessarily the middle price, but because 3 bids help you understand the project better. You start to see what's included, what's missing, what questions you should be asking, and whether one bid is unusually high or suspiciously low. Here's the practical advice with this particular tip. If you want a big project done this summer and you're just starting now, understand that you're probably a little bit behind, maybe a lot behind. That doesn't mean give up, but it does mean, start today. Let's get on it and be flexible with your timeline, and don't let urgency push you into a bad hire. If you're looking specifically for a painter, start at Repcolite, a close Repcolite store. Stop in, ask us. We've got names we can recommend. Or head to repcolite.com, and then about in the middle of the homepage, if you scroll to the middle of the homepage, there's a Find a Painter form. Fill that out, and we can help you with some names of people in your area who do the exact work that you need done. So that's a great resource to use. So check that out. All right. Fourth tip that I've got for managing your budget is know your home's age and adjust accordingly. Okay? If your house was built before 1980, add an extra 10% on top of that 20% contingency money that we talked about in step 2. Yeah, it just gets better, doesn't it? We're adding that not because something's definitely going to go wrong, but because the odds of a surprise discovery are meaningfully higher the older the house gets. Older plumbing, older wiring, insulation that maybe doesn't meet current code. These things exist in a lot of homes, and the odds are better than even that opening up one wall is going to lead to a conversation you weren't expecting to have. So know your home's age and adjust to that, accordingly. All right, the 5th tip that I've got. Understand the value of quality and the place for quality. Understand the value of quality and the place for quality. Here's a useful breakdown that a lot of people don't know going in. On a typical renovation, materials, fixtures, and finishes, they're going to eat up about 50 to 60% of your budget. Okay? 50 to 60% of your budget, materials, fixtures, finishes. Labor, permits, and design fees, they're going to account for another 25 to 35%, and what's left is everything else. Disposal, delivery, incidentals. What this tells you is that materials and finishes, they're often where the biggest budget swings happen. The difference between one counter and another can be thousands of dollars. Same is true with flooring, cabinets, appliances, and so on. And what that means is that when money gets tight in the planning stage, you're going to be really tempted to want to cut on these materials. This is where you can make a difference, right? Of course, obviously. It's where you'll make the biggest impact with the bottom line. But it's really important to understand the value of quality and the place for quality. And I'm not saying that you need to just invest in the highest quality materials that you can always find. I'm saying you've got to understand where quality will actually matter in your daily life and where it might not matter as much, right? a top-of-the-line wood floor, for example. They could outperform everything else out there, let's say. But if that means you get 30 years instead of 20 years, you've got to ask yourself a really practical question. Does that extra 10 years really, really matter? Now, if this is your forever home, you're never leaving, they're going to drag you out. They're going to carry your corpse from the place. Well, if that's the case, maybe that does matter. You want the best there can be. And if you can swing it, go for it. If you think you're going to move in 7 to 10 years, even 15 years, maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe 20 years is still really, really good, and it can save you some money. One countertop might cost twice as much as another option. But if it's something that you touch, clean, look at, and use every single day, that quality may be worth the price. It's not a budget decision that you're making at that point. It's a daily living decision. Same thing with paint. In high traffic areas, buy the best, the most durable paint that you can afford. Hallways, kitchens, bathrooms, mudrooms, kids' rooms. Those are places where durability really matters. You want the paint to wash up, to hold up, to look good for years. Repainting a few years after a big renovation because you tried to save a little on paint is a real bummer. But you don't necessarily need to put that super top of the line, Scuff-X or whatever, in a bedroom that gets, a guest bedroom or something. You certainly can if you got the budget for it, but that's a nice place to use some of our more budget-friendly options. You don't always need to jump into the highest end that you can, but don't cut the corners either so short that you end up regretting it, down the road. So if you do get to the point where you're cutting some finishes and materials, or you're, downgrading them a little bit in order to save some cash, before you do that, look at them each one by one and ask, where will quality improve daily life? Where will it reduce maintenance? Where will it help the project last? And where am I just paying more for something that won't really matter to me, down the road? That's how you protect the budget without cheapening the project. All right, tip 6, watch out for scope creep. Scope creep. You have any idea what that is? Scope creep is what happens when a project quietly grows after it starts. It's like sneaky growth. You begin with a bathroom repaint. Pretty straightforward, going to repaint the bathroom. And then you decide, well, we really should upgrade that vanity. And then you look at the exhaust fan, that's going to need changes. Then maybe the flooring, I'm not sure. What about the hallway flooring? That connects. If we're going to change one, maybe we should change the other. None of those decisions are really crazy. They each seem reasonable in the moment. But together, they can end up adding thousands of dollars to the final bill. So before the project starts, decide on what's included and what isn't. Write it down and agree on it. As a couple, as a family, whatever you've got to do, agree on it and share that list with your contractor. And then make a rule. Any new addition gets priced separately before you approve it. Not just, yeah, go ahead, let's do it. Not just, we'll figure that out later. Get the number and then decide. That doesn't mean you can't change your mind during a project. Sometimes that change makes sense. You see it better as you get into it. But don't let those changes sneak in. Just don't let them trickle in is probably the best way to say it, because they come in small, but they all pile up. Make them stand in front of you with a price tag attached, and that way you can really assess if that's worth it moving forward. Here's the truth about renovation budgets. They're a starting point. They're not a finish line. The data proves it. Most people go way over, and we all know that. Most of us have been there. Most people don't regret going over so much because the project was worth it. But there is a real difference between going over budget because you planned honestly and something unexpected happened versus going over budget because you really didn't have a plan at all. One of those is just life. That's how it goes. The other one's avoidable. If you do want to check this stuff out again, I know sometimes listening to this kind of thing on air, maybe that's a little tricky. If you want to read it, go over it and take a look at it. You can find all of it in the show notes. Just head to repcolite.com and click the On the Radio tab on the homepage. All right, it's front door season, and while that's nearly the perfect exterior project, there are still a number of things that you probably should know before you jump in. We're going to get to all of them, or at least some of them, right after this. You're listening to Home in Progress, where the projects are real, the mistakes, they're educational, sometimes painful, mostly educational, and the only thing more stubborn than that old wallpaper on your bathroom wall is your determination to get it fixed. Proudly sponsored by Repcolite Paints and Benjamin Moore. Paint with a purpose, people who care, and everything you need to get the job done right. And we're back. You're listening to Home in Progress by Repcolite Paints, sponsored by Benjamin Moore. And since we're heading into, the front door season, I want to spend a few minutes talking about that project and walking you through it. It's a project that makes a huge impact, and it doesn't take a lot of paint. So it's really ideal in that regard, but there are still some things that you want to know in order to get the best results. So here's the basic process with a few tricks that really can make the job go a lot better. First off, pick a mild, dry day and start early, ideally before the heat sets in. Heat on that front door or working in the heat can be a problem with how the paint lays out, and it will affect the overall look. So start early before that happens, and also that's going to give you plenty of time to let that paint dry before you have to close the door for the evening. Next, a big question that comes up is, do I take the door off the hinges? Well, for most people, that's going to be no. You just leave it on the hinges. If you're stripping it down, spraying it, doing major repairs, something like that, then maybe take it off the hinges. That makes sense. But for a normal repaint, most people are going to leave the door hanging up. The trick is to chock it open. Get a good door wedge or a block of wood so that the door stays partly open and doesn't swing while you're working. It's going to be a lot easier to work, trust me. Next thing you want to do is remove as much hardware as is reasonable. Take the handle off if you can. Take off the deadbolt plates. Remove the door knocker, the kick plate, and so on if it's easy to do, and then tape whatever's left. Then you've got to deal with the cleaning. And the cleaning, this prep work part of things is really important, because front doors get touched constantly. So they collect hand oils and dust and pollen and spider webs. Basically, they collect whatever the outside world throws at them. So wash the door down well with a good degreaser and then wipe it down and let it dry. After that, scrape off any loose paint, sand the surface dull and smooth, and wipe away the dust and give it one more good rinse with clean water. Now, if you've got bare wood, bare metal, or you've made spot repairs, at that point right now in the process, you would prime those areas. The big thing here is don't skip the primer if you've got a situation that warrants primer. All right, now let's talk about one of the biggest front door problems that people run into, and it's sticking. I'm sure you've run into this. The technical term is blocking. Blocking is when paint sticks to another surface after it dries. On a front door, that usually means the fresh paint sticks to the weather stripping, and then when you open the door, you get that, that peeling or popping sound, and sometimes the paint actually pulls off, which is a really sad day. Now, unfortunately, the way paint works, it can be dry to the touch and still not be cured. It feels dry, so you close the door. That's how people get into this problem. But the paint film is still soft enough that the weather stripping can press into it and bond to it. So one of the best tricks to avoid this is to remove the weather stripping if you can. A lot of modern weather stripping is set into a little groove around the door frame. If yours is like that, you can easily, get it out of there. Just take a flat tool, like a painter's 5-in-1 tool, a putty knife, something like that, and carefully, kind of pull it out. There's videos online if you need to see how the process works. It's very straightforward, very simple. You just want to make sure you don't gouge it, don't stretch it. Just work slowly and gently. If it comes out cleanly, pull it out, set it aside, and leave it out while the paint gets a good head start on curing. You could leave it out for a few days to give yourself the best chance to not have any of that blocking. That's one of the best ways to prevent sticking, because now the fresh paint really isn't being pressed against anything. It's not pressed against the rubber or the vinyl all night. Now, if you can't remove the weather stripping, the next best thing that you can do is just give it time. Leave the door open as long as possible. And again, this is why starting early really helps. So start early, paint thin coats, don't glob it on. 2 lighter coats are going to be way better than a heavy coat. So do all of that and use a good block-resistant product like Benjamin Moore's Exterior Aura or Benjamin Moore's Command. As for actually painting the door, if it's a panel door, you want to start with the recessed areas and details first. Use a good angled brush and paint the inside edges of the panels, then paint the flat panel areas, and after that move on to the rails and the stiles, the horizontal and vertical parts of the door. Basic idea is this: do the fussy detail work first, then move out to the broader areas so you can keep a wet edge. Ideal tools for this are going to be a good angled sash brush, as we've already talked about, but also a small roller system like Wooster's Jumbo Coater system. They're like little 4-inch roller covers, roller frames that are real small. That's going to be ideal for those flat sections. But like I said, make sure you've got that brush on hand as well for some of the fussier work. Front doors, they're one of the best small exterior projects you can do. A fresh color is really going to change, surprisingly so, the whole look of your house. You'll be surprised how much difference it makes. So it's a really good project to try. Just make sure that if you've got any questions, you stop out at any Repco Light store, give us a call, whatever you need to do. Ask those questions. We'll gladly walk you through the project. All right, that's going to do it for this episode of Home in Progress. If you want to catch it again, you can find it online at repcolite.com. Whatever you do today, make sure paint's a part of it. For Home in Progress by Repco Light Paints, I'm Dan Hansen. Thanks for listening.